of you I can see. Yes, so just a note there that we are recording, so please push continue on your screens. All right, so my name is Philippa Smales. I'm the Business Development and Member Engagement Manager here at the Council for International Development. And I'm honoured to introduce Tara to talk to you today. So Tara is a Senior Advisor of Inclusive Development at MFAT. She has a background in rights-based international development, social services and public health. She is mother of 4 with 2 mokopuna. Tara's current role is to lead the development, implementation and review of MFAT's policy on inclusive international development with a focus on gender equality and women's empowerment. So that's a big job. She is here to speak to us about the MFAT Gender Action Plan. Tara. Now just get your PowerPoint up as well so we can see that. Excellent.
Ea kurangatira, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko remutaka te maunga, ko te awa kairangi te awa, no te awa kairangi aho, ko inia aho te kainga tupu, kei mana tū aurere aho e mahi ana, ko kai whakama here mō tangata aho, ko Tara de Souza aho, no reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings to this really important hui. I come from the Hutt Valley. My mountain is the Remutakas. My river is the Hutt River. I have lived in the valley for 26 years, but I come from India originally. And I work for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. My role, as Philippa has just said, is the Senior Advisor for Inclusive Development with a Gender Lens. And I am Tara de Souza, and my pronouns are she, her. I want to thank the Council for International Development for hosting this event, and thanks to all the attendees for being here. And I want to acknowledge the kaupapa in this Zoom room, recognizing that you all bring really strong academic rigor and skills and experience to the work of development, of human development, and of sustainable human development, which is your work. So I wish to acknowledge that. I introduced myself using a mihi, I guess partly showing up my lack of fluency in te reo, but wanting to just flag the powerful indication that there is no hierarchy of the sexes in te reo. As many of you might know, the personal pronoun ia and the possessive personal pronouns tana and tona are gender neutral. And I guess it's something for us to consider that gender inclusion is not a new idea. I wanted to introduce the Gender Action Plan. Some of you may recall I've spoken previously of how we are arriving at this place of inclusion. I've talked previously of our inclusive development approach. And so this seems like a natural place to talk about where we've got to. Do I just...
yeah, just take. I need to tap instead.
Just here.
Yeah, there we go.
So just to be aware that the Gender Action Plan is available on the ministry's website, and the URL is up here on the slide. And if you have it to hand, that might help while I speak to it. I am planning to just follow this introduction with going through the purpose, goal, and strategic priorities of the action plan. Go into the settings and the alignment. Look at operating principles and the expected outcomes of this plan. And then we'll close and open the floor to questions from you, which I look forward to answering as best I can. So, the action plan is very much about addressing gender equality and women's empowerment. I guess it's important to recognize, to place this question in why gender matters. So the why behind this action plan. I don't think I need to really convince the audience about the compelling evidence about why women aren't achieving equality. The high rates of domestic violence, of gender-based violence, and violence against women and girls around the world, but particularly in the Pacific. The lack of representation of women in leadership situations, particularly, for instance, one of the metrics is in parliaments. Again, roughly 25% across the world, but only just under 9% in the Pacific. And the only 3 countries where women are not represented in parliament are in the Pacific, which is Palau and PNG and Vanuatu. High rates of women's unpaid care, care of household duties and care of children, care of family members. Across the world, something like 3 times more than men. In the Pacific, it's 4 times. And recognizing, I guess, that with COVID-19, these challenges are amplified. I think it's important to note that COVID-19 is a risk amplifier. It's not the root cause of these challenges, as we all know. So the plan sets out a goal of achieving transformative change by shifting the formal and informal customs that are embedded in our social systems, which actually create or perpetuate gender equality. We want to do this through targeted priorities. Our strategic priorities, which is looking at providing some guidance and direction for the aid program, are to place a focus on those activities that are actually mainly driving gender equality and women's empowerment outcomes. So this is our principal gender investment. Some of what you will see in the plan is some insight and some analysis of New Zealand's overseas official development assistance spend on gender, which is has been approximately 2.5 or 2.7% principal over the last 3 years. And we want to raise that to 4%. And why 4%? That's because that is an average of the OECD DAC members. We want to do this through some key areas, which again have been analyzed in the plan, which is the area of women's leadership and governance, the area of violence against women, elimination of, and social protection in response to COVID-19, but of course as a long-term response as well. We want to scale up our significant spend. So this is in activities that mainstream gender, that have an objective targeting gender equality. And these are in the areas of health, education, economic empowerment, And of course, we want to have a greater focus on sexual and reproductive health and rights, and women, peace and security. And the third area of priority is to build the capability of ourselves in the ministry, of our stakeholders, and across the sector. So I think we've covered the sort of what areas. I'm quite keen to look at how we do this, because I think inclusion is about process as well as outcome. And if we look at, thank you. We want to look at how we actually implement this plan, and we've developed some operating principles. Actually, these are principles for our development cooperation, and we have highlighted them as areas to strengthen in our inclusion work. So we would want our work to embody universal human rights, equity, and reciprocity. We want to recognize our Pacific partners as our kin fellows, the kinship relationship, which is the whanaunga tanga. We want to understand or recognize that there is a shared learning approach to this, given our own slow progress in some areas of gender equality and women's empowerment, particularly gender-based violence in New Zealand, Aotearoa. And we are quite keen to reflect Te Tiriti or Waitangi in all our partnerships. We're looking at partnering in a multidimensional approach. We want to be able to partner with local and in-country civil society, as well as New Zealand civil society. We want to be able to partner in a collaborative way with national governments in the Pacific and the rest of the world. We want to be able to partner with regional organizations and multilateral organizations, and potentially a collaborative way of doing this. And of course, we want to acknowledge the intersectionality of women's inequality, recognizing that disability, SOGI-esque issues, women with living with disability, women of Indigenous origin, rural and remote women would have greater and more amplified disadvantage. What do we want to achieve? Where do we want to go through this? I think our theory of change is very much about a transformational approach. We want to be able to address those deep norms that, as I mentioned, perpetuate gender inequality. We want women and girls to have a voice and agency as one of the dimensions of inclusive development. We want all people to have access to services and be able to be safe. We want economic empowerment as a key enabler to raise women to this platform of equality and empowerment. And we want to be able to do things beyond official development assistance. We want to be able to engage where advocacy is a possibility. We are actually promoting and advancing the rights of women. We want to look at international conventions and agreements and the negotiation space around that, particularly representing a Pacific voice. I think I'll just briefly mention what has shifted since we've had this plan approved. So I might just leave that on there. I think we're targeting gender equality and women's empowerment activities to a much more intentional approach. We're also giving more thought and gender consideration in our country strategies and in our 4-year plans. We're looking at ways in which activities and design concepts, ideas, and activities can be designed and implemented using a gender lens. So there's a really big intention to push the visibility of gender equality to improve the footprint that our aid program can actually show for what we are doing. And we are intent on achieving those targets in 3 years' time. So I'd like to close by saying that we look at gender equality as a human right. And I think this quote says it's not only that, but it is actually critical for achieving sustainable human development. It's a key principle for sustainable development alongside effectiveness and sustainability and resilience. So we do believe that our work, yours and ours, and the work of our partners is quite critical to achieve this. And we hope this plan will be one of the instruments that will guide us in that direction. Thank you very much. Ngā mihi, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
All right, so that gives us lots of lovely time for questions. And hopefully there will be lots of questions. So we will keep an eye on the chat. If you would prefer not to voice your questions, then please put them through the chat and Luke will ask them for you. But otherwise, feel free to unmute and ask away.
Kia ora. Hi Tara, Sharon Titchener here.
Kia ora, Sharon.
How are you? I was just interested in, great, thank you, that was really useful. I was just interested in, I'm assuming that the plan then is, the focus of the plan is then mainstreamed through your negotiated partnerships and spread out through then whoever have those partnerships with the local partners. And I'm obviously particularly interested in the Pacific. Is that how? So is it sort of mainstreamed through as gender, mainstreamed through those negotiated partnerships and then out into the local who the local partners are?
Thanks, Sharon. So negotiated partnerships is one modality through which we work, but we also obviously work through the multilateral organizations,
yep, through
national governments and through in-country partners. And what we hope to do is to have the activities that are being designed and implemented through these partners could target gender equality. So for instance, if it's an activity in sexual and reproductive health and rights, or if it's an activity that's addressing women's leadership, then or gender-based violence, then that's actually an activity that is solely focused on gender equality and women's empowerment. And then we want to look at gender being mainstreamed through all other activity as much as possible. So if there is an activity that is looking at, say, I don't know, improvements in agriculture or food security outcomes, then we'd want to be seeing what are the benefits accruing to women in that particular community or those communities. How are they participating? How are they being incorporated into the planning and design of the activity? What is the analysis of the context? We want to be able to see how those benefits are being influenced by the people who are actually part of the activity.
And that's great, because that was sort of what I was wanting to understand across the modern slavery and trafficking space. And as we know, there's not a lot of data across the Pacific region still around where that sits within gender and who, and we know obviously the universal data and what that points to, but it's going to be really good to understand more with New Zealand government's support into the Pacific in the space and human rights area to understand where gender and gender-based violence, etc., sits across those spaces. So that's really good. Thank you.
Well, thank you for saying that. I think this is a good time to say that I am one of a team of 3 senior advisors. The other 2, Claire Mann, focuses on human rights, and my colleague Maria Carling focuses on child and youth rights. And obviously there's a lot of overlap, considerable overlap in the areas of our work. So this is, I think, where we would collaborate to see how we could work alongside yourself, Sharon, and others in New Zealand Inc. as one of our key stakeholders in order to address this, which is really quite a serious human rights issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, just feel free to take yourself off mute and if you have any questions.
Kia ora, it's Angela Wilton here. Hello. Thank you, Tara, and thank you, Philippa, for hosting. So Angela Wilton, aho. I'm Angela Wilton. I'm formerly of Oxfam, but currently I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Auckland, studying this particular topic in great detail. So this is of great interest to me. So thank you very much. Tara, you probably expect this question of me, but in terms of the new Minister of Foreign Affairs, Nanaia Mahuta herself bringing in some very interesting, I suppose, Indigenous viewpoints around the way in which Aotearoa should show up in the world. I know that in the past too, she's spoken specifically about the mana of wahine and what that means in terms of how Aotearoa reflects these values in the global space. I'm just wondering how much of that and her influence and how much of a steer you've had from, I guess, the top around the development of this Gender Action Plan, or how much engagement or things have changed in light of having Aotearoa's first Indigenous woman Foreign Affairs Minister.
Thanks, Angela. I think that's a very valuable thing to note. We have a leader who's for whom this issue is very much at heart. Gender rights and human rights, she has expressed, are very key to her alongside Indigenous rights. So we have that permission space to progress this. But you probably know that we had started to develop this approach quite a long time ago. And there has been, you know, the fact that we were evaluating our own performance in gender equality outcomes was a big push. There was a parliamentary inquiry into foreign affairs and development outcomes, and that was another, you know, push to look at this. And then, of course, recognizing that our domestic policies influence and we work quite coherently with them, as the minister has actually suggested. So that is something that we've been able to strengthen as well. So looking at a much more holistic and congruent way in which we can promote and advance gender equality and human rights. So in short, I think the minister has strengthened the intentionality and given us the kind of endorsement to continue the way we're working.
Hi there. Can I go ahead?
Yes, go.
Hi there, I'm Peter. I'm Fred Hollows, New Zealand. Thanks very much for the presentation, very interesting. My question is, do you have a conceptual framework to kind of accompany the action plan? And I'm saying this because I formerly worked with an organisation, Care International, that had quite a strong approach to gender equality and women's empowerment. And we had a really nice framework of agency, relationships, structure, and engaging men and boys. And it was very helpful for conceptualizing, you know, how best to advance gender equality and women's empowerment. So yeah, I was just wondering if there was a framework to underlie the strategy. Thanks.
Sure, thanks, Peter. So we do have a theory of change, and the framework we're using is a transformational change framework. We want to be able to work in a variety of domains, if you like. We want to be able to, as I mentioned, have a multidimensional approach to our partnerships. So we recognize that there are some changes that have to address structural causes and the systemic basis of some of this. And we're looking at the area of legislation and regulation and policy in the countries which kind of provide some of that framework. One of our activities, for instance, is about supporting a regional working group in the Pacific to implement domestic violence legislation across 13 Pacific Island countries. And that's a way of actually saying, you've got the legislation, how does that actually roll out into services? So we recognize that there's a quadrant of change that needs to happen around that structure and systemic framework. Then we do have services that roll out of that, which affect all the areas that impact women's lives. The police system, the justice system, the services that are responding to, say, for instance, domestic violence or gender-based violence. We want then to have some of those services will be addressing things at community level, but some will be addressing it at the level of behavior change at individual level. And then we want to be able to address the really strong and deeply embedded cultural norms that we feel can be shifted by engagement quite closely on the ground. You know, we do know, for instance, that 90% of the people in the Pacific belong to a faith-based organization and will have a view of the world that is influenced by that. And one of the programs we work in it's called Pacific Partnership to Ending Violence Against Women, is engaging with the Pacific Council of Churches to look at really addressing this across the whole church institution. So needing to work across all those dimensions would be the framework that we are using. I don't know if that answers your question. I think the other thing to say is that in order to support this and to support that third work stream of building capability, we want to be able to provide, I guess, a strong kete of tools and a community that will strengthen a community of practice in this area. So really looking at ways in which we can support that analysis, the ways in which we can target the work in the particular contexts that we are working in.
Thanks very much. Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think that conceptual framework can also be a useful tool to look at, you know, the design of activities or programs and see how that can complement the work. But thanks.
That's right. So there will be what will cascade out of this plan is a number of things. There's a whole work stream of capability building under which we will have things like, mapping of stakeholders, an analysis tool, a tool for design of gender equality activities, a number of other things that we feel we will need to kind of consult with the sector to see how useful that is. But then we'll actually provide some kind of a framework, like you say, to be able to implement activities and also monitor and evaluate them.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tara. We also have a question in the chat as well from Aliala. It's quite a long question, but she's asking, considering the resources and time put into gender actions in the Pacific, There's a lot of literature and statistics saying that development objectives haven't improved gender status or have not been able to mainstream gender successfully. Is there any space to review the processes of gender mainstreaming actions? The Pacific is quite unique, and for one to talk about gender in Pacific society, you have to live or experience it to understand the dynamics in society. As we understand by definition, gender is a social construct. So what perspective is gender being constructed in this manner or in New Zealand aid development objectives?
Okay.
Big question.
Yeah, it's a big question and there's a lot in it. So I might take the one about the slow progress in the Pacific and absolutely acknowledge that. I don't think there's an easy answer to this. I do think the Pacific region is very committed to gender equality and women's empowerment. There's been the declaration from 2012. There are various other commitments to gender equality. The most recently, there was a triennial conference, the 14th triennial conference of for women in the Pacific, which again committed to particularly to three focus areas, which is women's leadership, women and climate change, and gender-based violence. And the women's ministers meeting that followed it endorsed that commitment. So I think Pacific-led and owned initiatives are quite critical for advancing this whole area. It's not that the answers sit in one place. I think women themselves have a very strong notion of what needs to change in their lives. I attended the meeting for the preparation of the resolutions for, or rather the agreed conclusions for the Commission on the Status of Women 64, which is in 2019 in Fiji. And one of the strong things that came out of that was the lack of social protection for women. So while we're advancing economic programs or programs for economic development, something as basic as that, which is actually the safety net that women need, when their work collapses, because most of them work in the non-formal sector, there is nothing to catch them. And that is something that actually has come out strongly from the Pacific, but even more strongly since COVID-19. So I think that there's an acknowledgement from this action plan that the leadership is already there in the Pacific, and our role is to support it.
Thank you for answering my question. I know it's a hard question. I'm just worried about culture, because I know culture is a very strong component of Pacific. And I see in the gender action, there's barely anything touching on just acknowledging the dynamics of culture in societies. From what the action is going to be, how is it going to be infiltrated into the society, just to be mindful of what's already there and not to disrupt or not to let it to more imbalance. Because what I've found out from our gender and climate finance research, a lot of men tend to be more objective, or they refuse to accept gender equality because they're focusing too much on women. Because I know in our society, there are areas where women are more important than men. And maybe those are the areas that needed to be more emphasized. I think that's my concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Eliala. I think that's a very important comment, and I think you are right. However, by not mentioning it doesn't mean we've not acknowledged. I think that's very critical to the Pacific, the honoring of the mana of the culture of in the Pacific, but recognizing that no culture is static. It's a changing and organic area of our lives. And so we know that can be influenced. and the balance between men, women, boys, girls, and diverse genders, people of diverse genders, is a constantly changing, but also an area that women can influence.
Yes, hi Tara, it's Catherine from World Vision here. I have a question around the rest of the world and how we, how New Zealand's multilateral contributions kind of play in terms of this gender action plan. So it's really known through a lot of evidence, and World Vision itself has done a lot of these kind of shock impact reports on how COVID has really impacted women and girls in really vulnerable communities across the world. So, and women's economic empowerment has worse, women's economic situation, has really decreased. Gender-based violence is hugely increased due to lockdowns and things like that. So I'm really interested to know how we kind of influence within that sphere internationally, and also how do we have a good handle on how we get results, or what's the impact of our contributions in terms of the multilateral system? Because World Vision itself, being a rest of the world person, I'm well aware of there's some great work going on in terms of in very conflict-driven circumstances and countries. So is there a bit more of a focus on that within the new plan?
I think the new plan is incorporating our existing support of the multilateral system and recognizing that our support of them is not just a financial support, but also contribution to their governance and their accountability. So I think that kind of is an overarching aspect of all our aid program. In terms of our gender equality and women's empowerment aspect, I mean, we would want to see that visible, and it is in some of the work that is being done, particularly with UN Women, UNFPA, UNICEF, where there's a considerable effort being put into these areas, particularly, and some of it has had to pivot because of COVID-19. But we've got UN Women working in the area of women's leadership through Women Make the Change, which is a program that's being run in Papua New Guinea, concurrently in collaboration with local civil society and other agencies, provincial governments. So we're conscious of some of the work they're doing. There's the Women's Market for Change program that is being run multi-country in a number of countries, where the leadership of women, particularly women vendors, is being focused on. And again, that program pivoted because of COVID-19 and needed to look at things like safety and social distancing and accessibility, and working with the local government, the local councils, in order to maintain the health and safety aspects and the prevention of disease and pandemic infection control. That all became part of that opportunity for leadership that was part of the program. I mean, that program also has an infrastructure aspect to it, which again, Women Vendor Association leaders would influence. So there's a multi-levels of engagement in some of that work. So I think we're conscious of what is being done on the ground, as well as recognizing that there are several levels of engagement and leadership and accountability that we want to be involved in. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I can provide as examples.
No, that's great. Thank you very much.
We also have a question from Brendan as well. So he's asking, when you talk about women and gender, are you only talking about cisgendered individuals? And if so, how much consideration is given to issues related to the transgender individuals who have their own unique challenges, along with the broader gender and LGBTQ plus sexual minority communities? And what work is done by MFAT to ensure that programs do not further marginalise individuals?
Kia ora, thanks, Brendan. That's a very important question, and I appreciate you raising it. I think by default, we talk about women's empowerment and women's rights in the gender program, but we actually are very conscious of the whole diverse gender community. My colleague Claire Mann, who works on human rights, is actually capturing that in her area of work. And clearly there's an overlap in the way we work. So we are not talking cisgender only, but quite a lot of our work does address women's equality and rights. And then we look at the intersectionality of that in terms of trans individuals and their rights. So I can speak on Claire's behalf, just to say that one of the activities that is currently being supported is supporting a network in the Pacific, which is working with civil society made up of LGBTQI groups and human rights defenders of these groups.
What's the name of that?
It's called Pacific Sexuality and Gender Diverse Network, PSGDN.
Any further questions? I might pop in with one then, since I have to. Oh, sorry, did we have another?
Oh, thanks. Just it's Phil and Rachel here from Caritas. We're in a borrowed room, so I wasn't sure if the microphone works. Sorry, no camera. Thank you, Tara, for the presentation. Excellent as always. Mine's more of a nuts and bolts question. You talked before about raising our measure of gender from 2.4 to 2.7, brings up the average of the OECD DAC. That's all very fine. What are you looking to include within that? Are we talking only gender transformative type programs or initiatives, or programs that can demonstrate solid mainstream or cross-cutting, or even gender integration? I'm just a bit confused at what you're talking about when you talk about those numbers. Also, can you also offer, because a few of us here are in the negotiated partnership, just relating to that first question, to our first year reporting, to make sure that we are providing the appropriate reporting criteria around gender that is going to be useful to potentially for those numbers and for you guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. It is Phil, isn't it? I can't see your photo, but yeah.
Sorry, yes, it is Phil. Yeah, thanks, Tara. Yeah, the camera's not working. I'm not sure what the story is.
That's all right. Well, let me explain the figures first. So the OECD DAC has a guidance on how we mark our activities in terms of gender equality and women's empowerment outcomes. And if the entire activity is focused on that particular outcome, then that is called a principal gender investment. So your entire spend is counted towards what we call principal gender. And the OECD DAC member average for that is 4% of official development assistance across the various 30 member countries. So we want to be able to achieve that spend. So the way it's done is if there is an activity that is, say, for instance, the gender-based violence and women's empowerment activity that we have partnering with the government of Vanuatu, the entire funding that is going towards that, and that is multiple partners. There's UN Women, there's UNDP, there's Vanuatu Women's Centre, but they're all working towards the gender-based violence elimination in different, using different approaches. There's a service implementation, there's the regulation of the legislation, there's the education aspect where people young people in schools are learning about what gender-based violence is and the various aspects of prevention of GBV. So there are a number of approaches to that, but that entire activity is targeted towards gender-based violence. And so we would count that as a gender principal investment. And similarly for negotiated partnerships, if one of your activities is to do with improving women's access to land and resources, then that would entirely be counted towards a gender principal spend. But if your activity is broader than that and looks at water and sanitation requirements, for instance, for a community, and you're recognizing that potentially one of the key players in terms of water collection and water use are women, and including them in the governance of that particular activity or the implementation of that activity, then that would be a mainstreamed approach to gender equality. And you would count that funding towards significant gender spend. And what we're wanting to say is that what we are currently seeing in the aid program, and that's across negotiated partnerships, the multilateral spend, the spend on bilateral activities, the spend on regional organizations, partnerships, is now showing us spending about 2.7% of principal and 55% of significant or mainstreamed. And what we want to see is more of that in both those spaces. So we are considering this action plan is influencing that, not just by the plan itself, but how it's operationalized. And we would want to see, in answer to your question for reporting, I don't know the specifics of what is required in your reporting, but I'm sure I can find that out through talking with the partnerships team. But I would say reporting should reflect what you're trying to achieve through your program for women in that particular project area.
Thank you, Tara.
I think we have some more chat questions. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Tara. We just have one question here from Rosie. She's asking, the Kingdom of Tonga is one of the few countries in the world who has not ratified the Convention of Elimination of Discrimination against Women. What approach will MFAT take to this challenge, and what does the Gender Action Plan look like in this context?
Kia ora, Rosie, thank you. Yes, we have, the Kingdom of Tonga has not ratified it, and Palau has signed it but not ratified it either. And there are a number of countries around the world, including the United States of America and the Vatican City, there are a few others. So it is a concern because that feels like if you've set an obligation against the international rules and law, then there is a bigger focus on meeting it. But we acknowledge the sovereignty of Pacific countries, and while we would encourage this, and while this Gender Action Plan encourages it, through its work with in foreign policy and advocacy, which we engage with. So for instance, we are very much active in the space around the Commission on the Status of Women, assisting with reporting against the various human rights obligations, including CIDO, the SDG reporting. So there are opportunities for that kind of engagement to be encouraging of reaching a place where the Kingdom of Tonga, the government of the Kingdom of Tonga, is comfortable about ratifying the CIDO.
Any other chat questions?
That's all from the chat.
Okay. Anyone else have any questions? Yeah, Angela's got her hand up.
One more, and I just thank you. I wanted to zoom out maybe a little bit away from the development space. I note on the Gender Action Plan, it talks about engagement with Trade for All. and noting that there's been considerable activity, I suppose, around women in trade and women and the economy. We're also hosting APEC this year, and I know that there are dedicated meetings around that too. Noting also that Aotearoa has signed kind of gender agreements with Chile and Canada in the trade space. I'm just wondering how much of what you've spoken about here extends into those areas, noting that everything is interconnected and that development cooperation, can't help on one side, and then we sign up to these trade agreements that then take away in the other. Meetings that I've been at so far are very much focused on women in New Zealand as trade partners and having equal access, the same with Māori trade partners having, I guess, access to international markets, but very little conversation around the impact of New Zealand's trade on women or marginalized communities in other spaces. This is perhaps going a bit beyond what you've discussed, but trade for all is absolutely written into the gender action plan here. So I'm just wondering what that might look like, and what your position is on that trade for all thinking.
Thanks, Angela. Our trade division is very focused, is very conscious currently of inclusive trade and the trade for all agenda. And we have, as you said, recently signed the Global Trade and Gender Agreement, the GTAG, with Chile and Canada. Part of that signing of that agreement is actually to bring on board partner governments and actually really consider what that means in terms of inclusive trade. So we have been making efforts to involve our Pacific partner governments in the Global Trade and Gender Agreement, which will then start to set up some dialogue around the conditions and the implications of trade on women, both in the Pacific as well as in New Zealand. So it is a work in progress, and I have to say we're taking very tentative steps in this space. And I'd certainly be interested to talk to you more about that. I'm sure we can learn from your research. Be very open to have a discussion with you, Angela. Thank you.
All right, last question for Tara. Well, we've got her here. Oh, everyone's gone quiet. All right, I will ask mine then. I was curious about alignment with other major funders, particularly in the Pacific area, because, with all the funders having their different plans,
Sure,
it can be quite confusing sometimes. So I'm curious about the alignment, especially with DFAT, perhaps.
yeah, that's a great question. So of course this is a hotly competitive space, and often there's duplication and overlap, and we're very conscious of that. So one of our key considerations is frequent and open communication with our development partners, and that is particularly with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia, and with other players in the Pacific. The EU has a big role to play in gender-based violence. They have a program called Spotlight Initiative, and we are actively in dialogue with them about that and how it fits with the other partners who are playing there. We work quite a lot with other development partners in the finance area, so the ADB and World Bank, looking at what they're supporting and how that fits in with the overall national development plans of the Pacific Island countries, as well as our own gender work. And I think the effort in that regard is to avoid duplication and to elevate collaboration, but also to allow our partners to drive the agenda. So I think we are very frequently in contact with our partners. During COVID-19, when the pandemic initially started, we had frequent development partner meetings. We have a series of meetings that Australia is leading, called the Pacific Women Leaders Meeting, which is actually it started off as an initiative of just gathering women leaders around the table to say, what are the impacts of COVID-19 in your various countries? How do we address those as a women's leaders group? And that particular series of meetings has now evolved into becoming part of the Pacific Island Forum Leaders Meetings. So there are a number of approaches that we're taking, which is about kind of trying to get frequent collaboration and conversation so that we're working together.
Oh, that sounds good. All right, well, I think we're pretty much out of time according to my watch. So I want to thank everyone for their amazing questions. It's really good to have some really good insightful questions to pull out some more of that information on that plan. And thank you so much, Tara, for joining us. And thank you, everybody, and we'll see you again next time.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody. Bye now. Ka kite anō.
Kia ora.